God is about to move in a big way. I feel that it's time for Jesus to return. I don't know how you feel about this, but that's the way I see it. So many things are happening right now that were prophesied in the Bible, and these are coming true. And it says these things are going to happen in the last days. And they're happening in front of our eyes. They're happening every time you open a newspaper. And I think that the Lord will be coming back soon, and before he does, I think that there will be a last revival, a last end days revival that we will see. That the church will wake up, because before Jesus comes back, he wants as many people as possible to be swept into the kingdom. And I'm very excited about this. Some of you may have heard me, but last fall, I got to speak at the women's conference here for the Assemblies of God that was held in Oklahoma. I know you were there, and maybe some of the rest of you who were here too. I don't know if you made it or not. But I felt that as I prepared for that particular conference in October or September, God really was, as I prayed for South Dakota, I just felt like South Dakota was going to be one of the areas that God really moves in. And, you might say, well, South Dakota, it's not maybe the most populous state. Why would he choose South Dakota? Well, interestingly enough, all the way through revival history, God has very often taken places that are sort of off the map. When I was on Spearfish the last few days, I told them about a revival, and I may tell you about this one too. It depends on how the Lord leads here. But I told them about a revival that was in the Hebrides Islands off of Scotland, off the west coast, clear out into the ocean. And one of the most wonderful moves of God, and it was 1949 to 1951 or 52 is when it happened. Why would he choose that island so remote? But he does this all the time. He takes places, not just populous places, but all kinds of places, and he moves. And besides, when I was up in Spearfish, I had an interesting thing happen, and that was that somebody had a word of prophecy that they had written back a few years ago, but it rang true with me. It was talking about the center of the nation. That's right here in your state, and up there in Belfouche, they say. So that area, the center, part of the prophetic word was that there would be like a spring that would flow out of the center. And I thought, wow, that really seems to make some sense. The whole church up to the fact that he wants to move. He wants to do some wonderful things, and he kind of wants us to open our eyes and get ready for what it is that he is wanting to do. Now, one of my favorite verses is actually, I'm going to move back to that, Psalm 85:6, and it says, "Will you not revive us again, that your people may rejoice in you?" And that's an amazing thing when you look at it, because when our hearts are revived, we find a rejoicing, we find a joy, a new and fresh joy that comes to us, and God really wants that. I personally that says that revival is not, I'll tell you what I don't think it is, and then I'll show you some examples of what I think it is. For one thing, I don't think it's just a special set of services. I think that's kind of a man-made thing. God is the one who does revival, and so when I use that term, sometimes we hold the term revival services to mean somebody like me coming in and preaching a set of special services. And I don't think it's just that. It's much more than that. It's a huge move of God that changes the whole area. And I also think that it's not necessarily God's best plan for us. And, you might say, well, why would she say that? Why would she say that revival is not God's best plan? Well, I noticed that all the way through church history, and I'm a student of revival. I've studied revivals for a long, long time. I teach doctoral classes, actually, at our Assemblies of God Theological Seminary in Springfield, and I've taught a revivals class there several times, and I always taught revivals classes at North Central. I've read on so many revivals, and I keep reading on them because I keep discovering more of them. All the way through history, God has moved in revival. But every time that he has, it's been at a time that there was kind of a low ebb. People needed to kind of be shook up again. And so, the word revival is interesting because it comes from the Latin word vivere, vive, that vive part, vivere, which means to live. And so the re means to live again. So I get this picture of somebody who maybe needs a paddle to have their heart jolted. It's like they're almost dead, and it's like, okay, I'm awake now. That kind of a revival. And I don't think that's necessarily God's best. I think that God would like the church to live vived, to be alive all of the time and not to have to be revived, resuscitated, so to speak. And I think that we can do that. I think we can choose to live in the presence of the Lord and be changed personally, no matter what is happening around us. So this is kind of my theology of revival. And so you notice here in Psalm 85, the psalmist says, will you not revive us again? He's saying we need the revival, but that we may rejoice in you. May we have that joy of our salvation renewed in us, that we would be changed. I also believe that revival or awakening, by the way, sometimes you've maybe heard of the First Great Awakening that happened in Europe and the United States back in the 1700s, the Second Great Awakening that crossed the whole country, by the way. There have been different, that's a term that is kind of synonymous with revival, but revival or awakening is a work of grace, and wherever and whenever it occurs, the prime mover, the initiator, the administrator of this distinctively divine activity is God, the Holy Spirit. He is the one that makes it happen. He is the one that brings it about. It's not any man's doing. It's not any kind of procedure. It's God that is the one who acts and does this particular work. And I believe that one of my favorite quotes of things when it comes to revival and this particular idea is the revival that happened in the Hebrides out in Scotland, the islands that I told you about. And Duncan Campbell was a very famous evangelist at the time, and he was the one that God used to, when the revival was occurring in the Hebrides. His name is very famous for that revival. He lived quite a few years after the revival happened, and he went around in the United States and told stories about what happened in that great revival of that island, which, by the way, saved literally the entire island. I mean, so many people, it's a big island, and so many people got saved, it was just like, it was the difference between day and night. God just moved in an incredible kind of a way. So he said, he actually has this taped, you can hear it on, if you Google it, you can actually find him saying this. He said, it grieves my heart that people say, this is the man who brought revival to the Hebrides. He said, he has a brogue, by the way, I didn't bring revival to the Hebrides. He says, I don't carry revival around in my pocket. And I think that's really good. I mean, no person at all carries revival around in their pocket. It's not something that man makes happen. It's a divine work of grace. In his eyewitness account of the 1904 revival in Wales, which right now I'm also planning to talk to you about, it's an amazing revival, David Matthews begins with these words: "Divine moments have their birthplace in the heart of deity." And I believe that is very true. It's like God births the thoughts of revival. It's in his heart to do what he brings about. Now, I will say, and I really talked a lot about this in Spearfish, any revival that's ever happened in history started in prayer. There is never a revival that didn't start in prayer and keep going in prayer. Prayer every single time is an element of revival. And why is that? I think there's a lot of reasons for it. One of them, I believe, is that it prepares us. It's not just trying to persuade God that he should bring revival. Remember, it starts in his heart. So it's not like we're trying to talk him into it when we pray and ask for revival. It's getting us ready for what God wants to do. Because when the presence of God comes, it is so amazing. It is so almost overwhelming. His holiness and who he is just absolutely incredible. And we have to be prepared to step into his holiness and into the presence of God. So prayer does that. It says that may seem to be inobvious and thus unnecessary to say, but there are many who have the idea today that we can originate revival and anything else we want. In reviewing the accounts of revival, whether in biblical history or church history, and there's a lot of revivals in the Bible too, by the way, seasons of spiritual refreshing from the presence of the Lord are seen to emerge in the providence of God. They usually come at a time of crisis, when the spiritual condition of God's people is in evident decline. The word of the Lord is scarce, and the lamp of God burns low in the land. And I think we can see that happening right now. I'd like to mention one other thing, and then I'm going to go into Argentina. C.H. Spurgeon, and you may have heard of Spurgeon, he was a very famous evangelist. He said, "How can we expect a blessing if we are too idle to ask for it? How can we look for a Pentecost if we never meet with one another in one place to wait upon the Lord? Brethren, if we shall never see much change for the better in our churches till the prayer meeting occupies a higher place in the esteem of Christians." And that goes along with what I was saying about the importance of prayer. When you think, his mention here of Pentecost, when you think about how that started, it was because there were a bunch of people waiting together and praying together and waiting for God to come. And so we need so much more of that today. We need prayer. We need to be seeking God and spending time in his presence if we're really serious about revival. And I think we should be serious about revival for a couple of reasons. One is it changes the church. And the church needs to, in general, across the United States, it needs to be woken up. I preach in a lot of places. I preach all over the world, actually, but it's sad sometimes, the state of things in some places. And I feel like, that's one reason I'm hungering for God to move here. And I feel that the church needs to wake up, but when revival comes to the church, then the next automatic thing that happens is that they want to go out and tell people about Jesus. They want to go out and share more about the Lord. It's just an overflow of what God is doing in their lives. And it becomes easier. There are things to talk about and testimonies and stories of God's goodness. And so there are always people that come to the Lord in revival. It's not just inside the church, it moves outside the church as well. Well, let me move to talking to you a little bit about Argentina. And where I'd like to start is in a spot that might kind of surprise you, and that is back in a sea captain who lived from 1794 to 1851. This sea captain was named Captain Allen Gardner. And I think the history of revival starts with Captain Allen Gardner, because even though revival itself didn't occur for Gardner, he laid down his life. And in so many times, in so many of the stories of revival, people gave their lives. They paid a price, and God did something as a result. By the way, one of my favorite revivals also is a revival in Korea. There was a very first missionary, his last name was Thomas. The very first missionary who went into Korea went in when it was a hermit kingdom, and they weren't allowing any Christians in whatsoever. They said they would kill them. And Thomas went in, and he knew how dangerous it was for him to go in. And he went in, and he shared the gospel. He gave away Bibles, and one day he was shot. He was martyred. 2 decades later, almost to the day that he was martyred, revival broke out in Korea, and one of the first people that got saved at the beginning of that revival was one of the guys, the guards, who had actually killed Thomas. You say, hey, I mean, Thomas laid down his life, but then here comes something spiritual. And I believe the same is true for Captain Allen Gardner. He he had his own ship, and he was a very strong Christian, and he felt the calling of the Lord to go to southern Argentina and to share the gospel with natives, the Indians down in that area, which was called Tierra del Fuego. And I have a map here, if you can see it. The blue part on the left-hand side is Argentina. It's kind of long and, takes up practically the whole southern part of South America. Next to it, the little skinny pink part is Chile. So between Chile and Argentina, that's the whole of South America. And down at the very bottom, where the tip comes out, kind of curves around almost, is Tierra del Fuego, which in Spanish, if you translate it, it actually means land of fire. And so I blew it up here on the right-hand side. You can see a plane coming into Ushuaia. Those are places where planes come in. But there's actually little islands, and on that one you can see a little better how you can get through. We've actually been to this area twice, like Punta Arenas and so forth. We've been in this area, and it is an amazing area. In the wintertime, it gets so cold there that the natives, they had to have fire in order to survive. And they kind of moved around from place to place in canoes. They didn't live just in like a little spot. So in order to survive, they would actually put their fire into their canoes and go to the next place where they were going to try to find some food and carry their fire with them. Otherwise, it would probably mean certain death. And that's where it gets the name Tierra del Fuego, the land of fire, from, because the fire was absolutely critical to their being alive. Now, this area is just beautiful, but it's exceedingly wilderness area. That's all I could say. It's just, there's mountains, lots of islands and things like this, and to survive in this area would be amazing. So here is this British man, Captain Allen Gardner, who says, I'm going to take my crew, whoever wants to go with me, and they were all Christians, down there to do missionary work with the Native Americans in that area. And nobody else had ever gone down there before. He was the very first one. And he knew that somewhere down there was a guy who had somehow or other gotten into England and trained in England and knew English. And of course, he didn't know the language, but he was hoping somehow to run into this guy, which in all of this territory, that's a bit of faith too, is it not? And he went down there, and he actually did run into the guy. There's a whole book on him in the Bible College, Rocky and Sherry Graham's Bible College in Buenos Aires, there's a whole book on Captain Allen Gardner, and it's his whole journal, his whole story of all of this. Now, I'll just finish this up rather briefly, but Gardner got down there. He tried to raise funds, and he did raise some funds, but he didn't raise as much as he had hoped from the churches in Britain. And he got down into there and had enough to last a few months, enough supplies, but he left another person who was supposed to raise more money for them and bring down more supplies so they could stay longer. They decided on a place and a date when they were going to meet to get the new supplies, and the bottom line is that the new supplies never arrived. The guy couldn't get the money. He didn't raise the money. And by the way, there's some statements from people that say this is to the everlasting dishonor of the British church. They didn't give to missions. And the guys, all of the whole crew, ended up dying. They all were dead from starvation. It's just a very, very, very sad story. And no, there were no salvations out of this missions trip whatsoever. And one after another, as they waited for this food to come and it never came, one after another, they would leave and walk off when they knew it was their time to pass away. And Gardner was the very last one to die. And this is his last words in his diary. Friday the 5th. Great and marvelous are the loving kindnesses of my gracious God unto me. I neither hunger nor thirst, though 5 days without food. Marvelous loving kindness to me, a sinner, your affectionate brother in Christ. So, and by the way, they hadn't had much food before that. I mean, they were sharing nothing, basically. I mean, rationing it out, trying to spread it out. So that 5 days didn't mean that he wasn't starving before that, and that's why he passed away so fast. So when I read this, I thought, Gardner laid down his life in the land of fire. And this is so early, and you don't see anything happening really much spiritually until the mid-1900s. So we have about 150 years in which Argentina sits without much witness. In fact, when the next wave of revival comes, there are only about 200 Christians in the entire country, probably not quite even that. And one of the missionaries that was there was named R. Edward Miller. He's now passed away, but I actually got to meet R. Edward Miller when I was down in Argentina, which was an amazing time for me. He was a missionary in Mendoza, which is in the northern part of Argentina. And in 1948, he had a crisis situation in his life. This is an actual picture of Mendoza. It's at the foot of the mountains. It's a very beautiful country. But he and his wife had been down there for a long time, and a couple of other missionaries, and there actually had just been nothing. I mean, people were not getting saved, nothing was going on, and he was getting so frustrated that he was ready to leave. He was just ready to say, I need to go to another country where, maybe they're more open or something, or I'm not making it. I mean, he had it, basically. And he was praying about this and seriously considering leaving. And the Lord said to him, I want you to go into your prayer closet, and I don't want you to come out until I tell you to. And that's what R. Edward Miller did. He fasted and prayed for a number of days. And he was praying all of the time. A couple of the other missionaries that were in the area said he was wasting his time praying. They said, why don't you do something worthwhile? And R. Edward Miller knew he had heard from the Lord, and he continued to pray. But there was no breakthrough whatsoever. I mean, nothing was happening. I think we've all had those experiences in prayer. It's kind of like, okay, what good is this? But I'm telling you what, it's always good. I mean, prayer always makes a difference. But with our Edward Miller, he had a situation in which, in this prayer time, he suddenly had a breakthrough. Before that came, he got out of his prayer closet one day and he said, I guess I might as well give up. I'm going to go out on the streets and I'm going to start handing out tracts like I always did. That's what they did in that time. And he said, and then I'm going to go. And he put his hand on the doorknob of his house and was about to turn the doorknob to go out, and there was a knock on the door before he got the doorknob turned. He opened the door, and there was a pastor from town who had his son with him. And he said, my son is rebellious. He doesn't want to serve the Lord, and he won't talk to me, and he won't talk to anybody else. But he said he would talk to you. And Edward Miller talked to the boy and actually led him to the Lord. It was a radical experience for the boy. And the Lord said to Miller after this, you get back in your prayer closet and pray, because I can bring anybody I want to you, and what I'm telling you to do right now is to pray. So he went back into his prayer closet, and there was a huge move of God one day. There was a breakthrough. He sensed there was a breakthrough. And he won't talk about it. When I was with him personally, I said, could you tell me about that? And he said, I won't tell anybody. It was really a very personal move of God. And after that, in 1949, there was a huge move of God in his town and in his church. And things started to happen. But as he went to his church, it was slow going. I mean, he felt so changed. He felt so revived in the presence of the Lord, but his church wouldn't join him. He kept saying, would you please come and pray with me? And nobody would come to the prayer meetings. One night, he ended up with 3 people in the prayer meetings, and he said they were the people that he probably would have least thought would be at the prayer meetings, or, and he hardly even knew what to do with them. They hardly even knew how to pray. And those 3 people kept coming back, and they prayed and they prayed, and there still was no breakthrough for the church as a whole. And one night he said, is anybody here, has God told you to do something that you haven't done, that you haven't obeyed? And one lady raised her hand and she said, well, God told me to knock on the table. But she says, that's stupid and I'm not going to do it. And so Miller said, well, please, I mean, that's not any big thing. Why don't you just do it? She said, no, I refuse. And so he said, okay, he said, let's all of us walk around the table at the same time, and when we say so, let's all of us knock on the table at the same time. And the lady said, and she walked around, everybody walked around the table, and everybody knocked on the table except for this one lady. And so by the way, what I'm going to say next, glad this is a small group and you can figure it out for yourself, because I'm just reporting. I don't understand the theology of it. But later on, the lady did knock on the table and everything broke open. I don't know why, knocking on the table. Maybe it's just a matter of obedience. Sometimes God just says, here's what I want you to do. It doesn't make any sense to us whatsoever, but if we obey, that's the key. And that was the key in this particular place. People started to get healed all over in the church. People started to get saved. Wherever R. Miller went after that, people were getting saved. There were so many people that got saved that he had to start a Bible college. There were young people that felt like they wanted to move into pastoring. There were people who got saved in their churches, but nobody to pastor them. So he started a Bible school to help train pastors to take care of all of these churches that were popping up. He also started an orphanage. And both of these things, the Bible school and the orphanage, were totally run by faith. He asked for no money from anybody ever. It was just what God had told him to do. He didn't know how he was going to feed these people at all, but God moved in and provided every step of the way. One of my favorite stories is of a little girl who one day came up from the orphanage, one day came up to him, and she was a very young orphan, like about 5 or 6. She pulled on his leg and said, Mr. Miller, she says, I want an orange. And he said, well, I'm sorry, honey, but we don't have any oranges. In fact, what the little girl didn't know is he didn't know where the next meal was even going to come from for alone having an orange. But God always provided every time. But he said, I'm sorry, honey, I don't have an orange, but I'll pray with you. Let's pray that God will give you an orange. Later that afternoon at 3 o'clock, the local grocer, who had never been up to the Bible college or rarely had been up to the Bible college, bicycled up the mountain to the orphanage, and guess what was on his handlebars? A whole box of oranges isn't that just, it's crazy when you think about it. God just did so many things. And I want to tell one other thing, and that is the last point there, that in 1952, God moved in a powerful way in the Bible school, which was at that time at City Bell. Now, for those of you who know Rocky and Sherry Gramps, and there were a few of you here that did, Rocky and Sherry he is the president, Rocky is the president of Instituto Biblical Rio de la Plata, which is the Assemblies of God Bible School in Buenos Aires, and people from all over South America and Central America go to that Bible school. I mean, it is a very renowned Bible school. It's probably the largest Bible school in all of South America, I believe. And this Bible school that I'm telling you about, that was started by R. Edward Miller and City Bell, is the beginnings of Rocky and Sherry's Bible school that has grown so big now and is in Buenos Aires. It was the start. And here is this school in City Bell. I've been to this place it's in La Plata, it's in a different town. I've been to see it. It's kind of on the outskirts of La Plata. And there was a boy they had like a big mansion for the Bible school. They lived in it. And the boy was from, he was a native, and there's a reason I'm telling you this. He was a native of one of the small towns near Mendoza, and he the native boys and the European immigrants didn't always get along for a lot of reasons. And that figures in what my story here. This native boy was out in the field, and he was praying one night, and they closed the gates of the Bible college, not realizing he was out in the field. While he was praying, the presence of the Lord came so strongly on him. It was like a presence that it scared him. The presence was very holy. And you can think about some of the stories of people seeing angels in the Bible, for example. It just frightened him. And he got up and out of his prayer, and he went, and the Bible school gates were closed, and he's banging on them because people were in bed. And he's banging on them, trying to get in. Finally, someone heard him, opened the doors, and let him in, and the presence of the Lord came in with the boy. The presence of God was so strong that everybody got scared. There's stories of the students jumping into bed with each other, shaking because they were so scared. Finally, they all got the nerve to get up, and they started a prayer meeting. This boy who had been out in the field started to give words in tongues, many, many different words, and there was a European immigrant boy who ended up getting the interpretations for the words in tongues. And he got scared also. The minute he tried to open his mouth to give the word, he ran out of the room. I mean, he was just almost petrified. And finally, they gave him a piece of paper, and he started to write down the interpretations, which, by the way, is a good thing. Those are all saved and in a book that I have had an opportunity to read, and the interpretations of those things and the prophecies that were going to happen did come true. What occurred in this move was that they just stopped classes. The move continued for days. They prayed until it is said that the students left puddles of water under their feet from their tears. They were praying for countries all over the world. In fact, one of the boys, the fact that, by the way, that it was a European and a local boy in the tongues and interpretation was one of the, and they normally wouldn't get along. You could see that the Spirit was moving, and that always happens in revival. He kind of takes down the dividing walls. And it was so cool because one of these, the boys, he ended up praying and speaking in tongues and naming capital cities and countries all over the world, praying all over the world. And there were other missionaries there who knew the countries and knew the capitals, and the cities that he was praying, but this boy was totally uneducated, and they knew the boy didn't know it at all. And so this kind of thing kept happening. They prayed for several months, basically. They prayed for Argentina. They wept and interceded and finally felt like they could start school again about 3 or 4 months after all of this went on. And they started school again, but only according to how the Spirit told them which classes to start and who was supposed to teach them. And that's how it all began, exactly how the Lord wanted it to teach. And some of the people who had never even taught before started to teach, but people said it was just the most amazing revelation from God, things out of Scripture that just came alive through the Holy Spirit teaching that occurred. So 3 prophecies occurred. Several prophecies occurred that people said were not of God. A lot of people made fun of this move of God. They usually do when there's a move of God. They said, one, that Eva Peron, the president's wife at the time, would die. If you know your history, you know that Eva Peron was very popular in Argentina. Evita, the story of Evita. She did die ultimately, but not for a few years after this prophecy. So everyone said, she's healthy, this isn't going to happen. Another word of prophecy that came was that there were going to be a big move of God, and it would fill the soccer stadiums of the country with people who would get saved, with Christians. And everybody made fun of that too, because they said, there's 200 Christians in this country. You couldn't even fill a soccer stadium with Christians. If everybody in the country came, it just, that's a stupid prophecy. So they didn't believe it. And there were several other things like that happened, but every one of the prophecies ended up coming true, but after a few years. So it tested their faith. They had to hold on to it. They had to see what God was going to do. Fast forward to 1954. By the way, there had never been any kind of a meeting ever in a soccer stadium other than for soccer. If you're familiar with Argentine soccer, it's like it. You didn't use the soccer stadiums. That was another thing that was crazy about it. You didn't about that prophecy. You just didn't use the soccer stadiums for anything except soccer. So, nobody believed that either. In 1954, Tommy Hicks was an American missionary who knew Spanish. He had been in a Central American country, and he felt a call from God to go down to Argentina. And he headed down there on a plane, not knowing what he was going to do when he got down there. He didn't have an invitation or anything. He just decided he needed to go down there and paid for his way to go down. He had felt that the Spirit, as he had been praying, had told him to talk to a Perón. But he didn't know anything about Argentina at all. And so on the plane, he talked to the guy next to him, and he said, do you know a Perón? And the guy said, Presidente, el Presidente. I mean, like, yeah, the president of the country. And Hicks goes, okay. And at the time, Perón, this is their White House. They call it the Casa Rosada, which is the Rose House. You can see why. But Perón was living there. Eva Perón, his wife, had passed away. He, unbeknownst to anybody much in the country, was having terrible difficulties with a wasting skin disease. It was terrible. His skin and his face all over his body was awful. He had spent tons of time sneaking out of the country, going to Europe and just about every medical doctor that he could possibly find to try to get the skin disease fixed, worked on. And nobody could help him at all. This had been going on for quite some time. He was making no public appearances whatsoever because he was embarrassed of it, and he wasn't seeing anybody. So Tommy Hicks goes up to the Casa Rosada and says to the guard that he wants to see Perón and Presidente Perón. And the guy says, no, you must be kidding. I mean, it would be like us walking up and saying, can we see the president? I mean, yeah, right. Okay, so the same kind of thing there. But Hicks didn't know what to do. I mean, that's the only thing that God had told him. So he said to the guard, he said, I see that you're limping. And by the way, the guard had a congenital disease, like a limp that he had a deteriorated leg from the time he was a child. And he had this all along. And Perón said, can I pray for you before I go? And the guard said, well, okay, sure. And he prayed for the guard, and the guard was immediately healed, which, by the way, just went like crazy all around because, the rest of the guards always knew him with a limp. And here he was healed. And he said, well, come back tomorrow. And what he did was to tell Perón what had happened to him, and Perón agreed to see Tommy Hicks. So Tommy Hicks goes into the president's office, and he says to the president, the president says to him, what is it that you want? Why are you here? Why do you want to see me? And he said, I would like to hold some Christian meetings in and he named one of the bigger soccer stadiums. And I think it was the Hurricane. And he said, I would like to hold the meetings there. And the president just laughed at me. He said, we never do anything in our stadiums other than soccer. He said, no. That's not going to happen. And he started to dismiss him, and Hicks said, before I go, I can't help but see that you have a problem. And could I pray for you? And the president said, well, yeah, sure, go ahead. So Hicks prayed for Perón, and Perón's wasting skin disease totally went away immediately. Can you believe that? Perfect skin like a baby. And Perón said, what is it that you wanted again? And he gave him actually a bigger stadium and told him he could have it for as long as, within the season where there wasn't any soccer. And he said, and I will give you all of the national media, which totally opened up things. In fact, this next picture is one of the get-togethers in the soccer stadium. He had to move to a bigger one. There were so many people that came that the soccer stadiums were immediately filled up to overflowing. They were like wrapped around the stadiums trying to get in. They would start at 8 o'clock or earlier in the morning, camping out, trying to get into the stadiums. So many people got healed. They brought ambulances from all of the major hospitals with people on stretchers, brought them out of a stretcher, put them into the middle of the grassy field area, of the stadium, and they would all be healed. They would go up, pick up their their pallets and walk out. There were people bringing kids and they would get healed. The very famous people, by the way, some of them were the kings and queens or presidents or whatever the high officials would be in countries from all over, Central America, South America, who had family members, children, etc., who were sick, and they were all healed. It was amazing. There were so many thousands of people that came to know the Lord in these crusades. And I really believe that the breakthrough was back in Mendoza with R. Edward Miller in his prayer closet. I mean, you know, it was just, I could go on in the stories on this. I have tons of stories about Hicks. But I'm going to go to the next wave of revival that happened, which was about 30 years later. And this is with Carlos Anacondia. La Plata is actually the capital of Argentina, not Buenos Aires. La Plata, Carlos Anacondia was a businessman. He got saved. He started to, he just read the Bible all the time. I mean, he really felt God was calling him into evangelism. And he was little known at the time. Right now, he has won millions of people to the Lord. I mean, he does. Maybe you've even heard of him. He's like a Billy Graham. He has gone everywhere, all over the world, sharing the gospel, and tons of people have gotten saved and healed. But by the way, when this was happening, nobody knew him at all. He was just starting out. And he went to a pastor in La Plata whose name was Alberto Scataglini. And Scataglini he's a very humble man. I've gotten to meet him too. And he was telling the story about how he felt revival was going to come to La Plata. He'd been praying with the teens that this would happen. He talked about Carlos coming to him and asking if he would help him and support him. I mean, not with money, but even just, you know, that he could come into La Plata. And Alberto didn't know him. But as he was listening to him, the Lord said to him, this is my man, and I want you to do exactly what he tells you to do. And so Alberto said to Carlos, what is it you want? And he said, by the way, I am Elisha, you are Elijah. What do you want? Do you understand what, I mean, the elder was saying to the younger, I'm Elisha, you're Elijah, out of respect to him. In other words, tell me what you want. And Carlos said, well, I want a tent. And Alberto was saying to us, I just didn't think that would work. I mean, Argentines are very sophisticated. They're not going to tromp out in the mud to a tent. And I started to say, this isn't going to work. And instead I went, okay. You know, because he had told him he'd do what he wanted. And he said, when do you want to have this? And Carlos said, well, I want to start in 2 weeks. And Alberto said, my first thought was, we can't do this. We've advertised other things like this. Nobody comes. 2 weeks is too short. This isn't going to work. And he started to say something, goes, okay. Well, it went like this. They ended up with Carlos starting in a tent, first tent meeting in Argentina ever, and hundreds and thousands of people started to flock to it. People were getting saved by the droves and healed by the droves. There were so many people that got healed in these meetings, that the witch doctors started to get converted. And the reason they did, the whole town was full of witches. And they were trying to pray for certain people, you know, to get healed, do fetishes, the whole bit. And they weren't getting healed. And one night, Carlos said, well, whoever has relatives and stuff at home who, you know, they can't come to the crusade, you can bring a piece of their clothing and put it in a pile, and we'll pray over it. Well, the witches started to put their stuff from people they couldn't heal into the pile, and they got healed. And the witches went, well, okay, this God is bigger than our God. And they got converted. Just tons of them got converted. They would put signs up on their witchcraft doors, gone to the crusade, come on over or something like that. You know, I mean, it was just, it changed the spiritual atmosphere of the area. And so many people got saved. They were coming to the church all the time. Alberto couldn't even, he didn't change his clothes. He stayed in his suit all night long because he actually couldn't get changed. It was just a wild thing. And he said, he sat there in front of us, in front of our team, and he started to cry. And I thought, oh boy, I mean, after hearing all of these amazing stories of all these people who got saved and all this stuff that happened, why is he crying? And he said to us something I will never forget. He said, and we weren't ready. And I feel like God is wanting to say to us tonight, let's get prepared for what God wants to do. Because in any revivals, when God starts to move, there is such a huge move that happens so fast. This is a picture of, I think it's the next one. No, sorry. This is, I had a picture, you saw some of the pictures of his revival, but he just brings huge people in. One time, by the way, Carlos was preaching by a prison. He always likes to crank up his sound so that anybody around him can hear. And he did that by a prison once. And one of the prisoners listened and got radically saved. And he was so changed, everybody started to give him a hard time in the prison. I mean, the guys were kicking him and abusing him and doing all kinds of things because they wanted to see if they could rile him up. And he was so changed that a number of the other prisoners got saved. This ended up with the whole cell block that this prisoner was in getting saved. The prisoners were such model prisoners that the head of the prison came to that cell block and said, I don't know what's going on with you guys, but we like the way you're behaving. So how would you all like to split up all over in all of the blocks of the whole prison? And, you know, maybe you could help everybody live a little bit better. And they did, and in the end, the whole prison got saved, which ended up with a bunch of them feeling like they wanted to be pastors, but most of them are in maximum security prisons for life. So they started taking some of these guys and allowing people in, like IBRP, they go in once a month, but others too, to go in and train these guys, the prisoners, to be pastors in other prisons. And I got to go in there and talk to some of them and preach a couple of times. And one of the times I felt so led to talk about the baptism in the Holy Spirit. They all come up, they're all standing there with their arms to their side. I mean, they're, you know, different denominations have affected them. So they're standing there like, what is this all about? The Bible college students started to lay hands on them, and I was laying hands on them. People were going out in the Spirit by the droves, speaking in tongues. It was absolutely the most incredible thing you have ever seen. And these guys are going back into prisons all over the country to share the gospel. This has been such a move of God that is so public all over the place that they have actually done a documentary on the whole prison system in Argentina and how it's been affected for Christ. And that's where I'm going to stop. I have more waves of revival. Question for you. What would you like to do tomorrow night? Should I finish up Argentina or should I do a different revival? What would you like? Yeah, that's part of it, isn't it? But I think they could probably pick up without this, you know, and that's why I offered it that way, because I could take some of the more modern stuff that has happened now, which I haven't gotten to yet, and I don't think they'd be, I mean, they're going to miss this part, but I think they would still understand the next part. But it's kind of up to you, because you see, I teach whole classes on this. I can go on forever. Are you bored? You okay? You okay? Okay, I'll pray and see where God takes me. What questions do you have? Or comments? How does this strike you? Talk to me. What's that? Mhm. And that happens in revival after revival. That really is an encouraging thing. Yeah. Well, that just happens over and over again. I mean, the stories of the revivals, it's a few people. In the Hebrides, it was two little old ladies, 84 and 82, and then the pastor and the deacon started, and, just a few, and then the whole island gets changed, And in Wales, it's Evan Roberts, just a young man, and he preaches to his own youth group, and they all get revived, and the whole nation, literally the whole nation gets changed. In Ireland, near Ulster, it's 4 young men whose Sunday school teacher said to them, I dare you to pray, and to get together and pray one night a week. And the young men took them up on it, started doing it, and thousands of people it was spread all over Ireland. It was just incredible. People were wandering out of their houses under conviction, coming to the square and, getting saved, crying out to God for help. It's just story after story. It's just really incredible. So I am not, by the way, this is a fine group. I mean, this group right here, you can change Rapid City. You can. I mean, if you decide you want to pray, this is a plenty big enough group. This is bigger than some groups that started revivals. So, I'll turn it over to you.
Guys, have a good night.